Okay, guys, the recording has started. I'll begin once again. Sorry for the delay. Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Shreyansmal, the Sundarban Secretary, and I'm truly excited to welcome you all to the very first episode of our series, Voices of Power Women Shaping Tomorrow. Now, this series was created for a very nice purpose to basically to shine a light on the stories of inspiring women who are making significant impact in their fields and in society. So, what we wish to do is across the 9 or 10 episodes, we'll be discussing important topics that affect women today, whether it's about legal rights, leadership, or health. Each session will bring forward key insights and lessons that we can all learn from. Now, the idea behind this series was not only to highlight the voices of these women, but also to provide a platform for such meaningful conversation. So, what we wish to achieve is through these discussions, we hope you feel more informed, inspired, and empowered to make a difference in your own lives and communities. Now, introduction to today's session basically. For today's session, we will be focusing on the topic that is very crucial for all of us: legal rights for women, whether in the workplace, at home, or in societies. Understanding the laws that protect women is vital. So, we want to provide you all with the practical knowledge and help you understand how to navigate these rights in real life situations. Uh, we are confident enough that today's discussion will not only be insightful but also give you the tools to be better informed and more confident when it comes to legal issues surrounding women rights. Now I'll be handing over the mic to my co-host Swati, who will be introducing you to our speaker of the day. You can go on now, Swati.
Thank you, Shreyans, for giving me this opportunity. So, very first of all, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for giving us your time. I am going to take some moment to highlight some exceptional contribution of yours. Hello, all. This is Swati Singh, and as we all know, that we all have gathered here for the very first session of our series, and we are going, and I'm going to share you some of the highlights of Rama Sarude ma'am. Rama Sarude ma'am is a lawyer and trainer specializing in matters related to the prevention of sexual harassment, pause, at the workplace, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, and human right advocacy. With over 24 years of experience, she has served as an external member of POS committee in various corporations and educational institutions and has developed scenario-based video modules on POS. Currently, the director of Sayog, registered trust under the Bombay Public Trust Act, ma'am plays a vital role in providing consultations and legal assistance to vulnerable groups, including survivors of domestic violence, child sexual abuse, and people living with HIV. Her proactive work has included organizing uh, paralegal training programs for prisoners, conducting training sessions for judges, police officers, and civil society organizations, and traveling across Maharashtra to address issues of social justice. As the advocacy officer of Avan, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, she worked to lower HIV prevalence in high risk groups like sex workers and MSM. MSM refers to man having sex with man uh, across 10 districts in Maharashtra. She has also trained human rights defenders, conceptualized legal aid programs, and produced a documentary on human rights titled Right to Life. In addition to her extensive legal expertise, ma'am is also a certified NLP trainer and digital content developer. Her contribution extend in numerous organizations, including to Maharashtra Judicial Academy, Women and Child Development Department, and Pune Police Academy. Her tireless advocacy and impactful training have made her a leading figure in the field of human rights, gender justice, and legal education. And with this, I would request you all to give a virtual round of applause for ma'am. And with this, I am handing over my mic to ma'am.
Good evening, all, and I really thank the Sundarbans House to invite me here to share thoughts on my work, and they've asked me to focus the discussion on the law related to domestic violence and prevention of sexual harassment. It's a pleasure to interact with all of you young minds, and I always enjoy such interaction because there's a huge learning for me as a person, when I interact with young people. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about my journey. I come from a small town, a district called Belgavi from Karnataka. It's a border district of Karnataka and Maharashtra. And I studied till my graduation there. Then I shifted to Pune to do my law. And then I did my LLM twice, and then I also did my MA in sociology because I was interested to work in the society. And then I started working in the various areas that relate to law. I worked in the prison to provide free legal aid and take up pro bono cases for prisoners. So I would visit the women prisoners and understand what their plight is. And they most of the time didn't have representation from lawyers when they were the only accused and there was no male accused involved. I've worked with sex workers for their legal rights and to bring down prevalence of HIV, but basically to stop violence that they face. I've also worked with LGBTQIA plus community. I've done some work with people with disability or differently abled people. I've taught students as a visiting faculty in some of the colleges in Pune, and my focus of work has been women and child rights. So I've been part of the consultations that have happened to draft the domestic violence law. I was just out of law college back then, and I had the opportunity to interact with great minds with great experience and be a part of the whole drafting of the law when there were consultations happening across India. So obviously I was also the master trainer to train people who were then appointed to implement the law. And I have also authored a manual for lawyers as part of a series that was done by the Women's Studies Center of the ILS Law College. And that manual has now been accepted by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. So it's on their website for anybody to use. I've also been a part, I work very closely with the government. I've also been a part of a committee that that was selected to draft rules for the state of Maharashtra on the law related to child marriage. And the rules have been accepted by the present government. And now most of my work focuses in the area of prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. And I work across corporates and government and colleges and universities, to create that awareness and to handle cases if they are reported. Apart from that, I also handle matters of family law. The best part of my work is that I don't go to the court and litigate. So I don't really have to go to the court to fight because I have a team of lawyers who do that. Fortunately for me, my husband also is a renowned lawyer in Maharashtra. So he takes up the cases. I do the consultations and the back end work. So I get to enjoy my time as a trainer, and I have the connect of what's happening in the judiciary, and I can take that experience back, when I do my trainings with basically the officers who are supposed to implement the law, whether it is the judges or whether it is the police officers or whether it is the protection officers. So I get to take that experience back to them and give them a practical understanding of how the law is implemented and what they need to do to implement it better and effectively. So I thoroughly enjoy what I do because there's a connect with the people, with the community, and I get to interpret the law, out of the box and look at strategies to see how it can benefit the people and the objective with which the law is made. So that's about how my journey has been. I'm a director in a startup called My Growth Zone, which is basically an organization that works to train people in the leadership positions, and we also develop content, video-based content mainly. And I'm also the director for a LLP firm that we have started, Asim Sarode and Associates. That's basically a law firm. And I'm on advisory of a lot of NGOs, supporting them with whatever legal assistance that I can. So that's about how my journey has been for these last 24 years. To come to the topic that I have been given, so I'm looking at violence within the four walls. And outside the four walls, although there's a huge, I mean, when we talk of law and when we talk of women rights and child rights, it's a huge gamut of laws. But because of the paucity of time, I will just restrict this discussion to two aspects of the laws that are important. And I will not really be talking in terms of the legal provisions, but probably share my experience of how we've handled cases. So the first law that I'm going to talk about is the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. And this law is a civil law with criminal implication. It came about in 2005. And this is one law that was really democratically made with the participation of people coming from various fields. Lawyers like me participated. There were counselors, there were women rights activists, there were judges, there were officers from the Women and Child Development Department, and there were consultations happening across India, and that's how the law came about. So there's a huge experience of a lot of people that has gone into drafting this law. So what did the law do is that there was a criminal law on domestic violence earlier that had come about in the 80s. But mostly women did not want to use the criminal law because, one, it was restricted to only marital relationship. And as we know the position of women in the society, it was not easy for them to, quickly go and file a criminal case against their own people, especially their husband, their in-laws, because they knew that if they did that, the marriage broke. And they couldn't do it without the support of, their natal family. And so a lot of women stayed in a violent situation without any kind of redressal mechanism for them. And if they did file a criminal case, then obviously the results were that they had to step out of the house. Sometimes they became homeless. They were worried about what are they going to do with children if they didn't have support from the natal family, and if they were not earning, it was a huge challenge for them to take this kind of a decision. And that is why the civil law made a lot of sense, because it did not imprison anybody, but it gave women certain rights. Now, what this 2005 law did was that it extended the definition of domestic relationship, and they said that this law will not only apply in marital relationship, but it will also apply in relationship that are because of blood, relationship because of adoption, relationship that are in the nature of marriage, which means live-in relations. They are not really married, but they're living like husband and wife. So they extended the purview of the definition of domestic violence. And what they also did was they defined domestic violence to mean physical violence, psychological, emotional, mental violence, sexual violence, and economic violence. So when we started practicing in this area, a lot of people did not know of what was economic violence. What would that really mean? And the women gets a remedy under this law. So she gets a protection order which stops the violence from happening. She gets a resident order, which means that the house doesn't become in her name, but she has to have an accommodation. It could be an alternate accommodation, it could be rent paid for her accommodation, or it could be a room or two rooms in the accommodation where the family stay. But she can't be homeless. She can't be just sent out of the house without an accommodation, is the protection that this law gave. The third was that she got monetary relief. So whether it was her maintenance, or whether it was paying the fees of the children who stayed with her, or whether it was her health care, or whether it was loss in the wages, she got some form of monetary benefit from the perpetrators. And she also got custody, which is a temporary order, so that she doesn't have to fight for, there was a lot of blackmailing that happens, that if you leave the house, we are not going to give your children to you. And probably, a mother it's difficult for her to stay without her children, and so that shouldn't be the case, and so she got temporary custody order, and there was also an provision for her to get compensation. Now, do they all I mean, are these orders do they come very easily to her? They don't. There's a lot of struggle. However, when the law really came about and not all, many lawyers were practicing in this area, we were able to bring in a lot of out of the box thinking in this law. And let me share an example, of a case that we dealt with. So here's a lady who was the wife of an ambassador. And this guy was an ambassador of India and had served in many countries. So imagine the status that this wife had, right? So she was somebody who would, I mean, the cricket team went to that country, she would have lunch and dinner with them. She would meet big stalwarts who visited that country. So that is the kind of lifestyle that she had. And suddenly this man fell for another lady, and he started having an affair with another lady. And that is where the whole violence against his own wife started, where there was physical violence in front of the children, to an extent that it impacted the older child. And he had a lot of mental health issues growing up because he'd seen the violence happening. The younger one was very small when she left that country and she came to India. Fortunately for her, her brother was very supportive and he supported her throughout. Now, all this, she left that country and came to India around the year 2000 or 2001. And that time we did not have the law related to domestic violence. So she filed a case for divorce and maintenance, and she kept going to the court, and she didn't really get any relief because her husband would never come to the court, and he was a high ranking officer, so he enjoyed a kind of an immunity. That's what he thought. So he didn't come to the court. In 2006, when the domestic violence law came into effect, right? So her lawyer, who was handling her divorce case, suggested that she meet us, because we were part of the drafting, so we had a better understanding of the law related to domestic violence. And they said, why don't you meet them and see if there's a possibility for you to file a case under the domestic violence law? And now the violence had happened in 2000, the physical violence. They were staying separate from the year 2000. And yet we said that, yes, I mean, the violence is retroactive, and so we should file a case. So we filed a case in the court to say that the violence is retroactive because she's still not getting maintenance. So there's economic violence. She's going through a lot of mental harassment because of the situation that is created, that she's dependent on her brother for every little need. She has to take care of the two children without any means, and that is impacting her. She's going every day, she has to think, where is that next rupee going to come from for the basic expense that she has to meet. And look at the lifestyle that she's lived, or the lifestyle that she can have, so that's why the court agreed, and they said that yes, she should get maintenance. We said that she should also get a resident order. So this man had 2 flats in his name in Pune. So we said, open up 1 flat for her and let her stay in that flat. So the argument that the other lawyer had, his lawyer had, was that you can't be talking of a violence that has happened before this law has come, because no law applies retrospectively, right? It's always prospective. It's never retrospective. So we said that this is not retrospective, this is retroactive. Although the physical violence started in 2000, it still continues. Although the physical violence has stopped, the mental harassment has not stopped, the economic violence has not stopped, and hence this is a case of retroactive, which is retroactive in nature, and she must get her rights. The court agreed with this. She got a maintenance and she got the house to stay. Later on, he said that I am going to go to the Supreme Court. He had the means to go to the High Court. He went to the High Court. We put in the same argument. The High Court also said that that's right. She should get maintenance and she should get that house to stay because the violence continues. And then he went to the Supreme Court. So we were waiting for the judgment to come from the Supreme Court as well, but I think he just got tired fighting all those cases, and then he gave her a deal, and he said that I'll pay you an alimony and I'll also give you the house. So she got a very good alimony, and the house was given to her. He put her name in the house and he withdrew his name. So she got her rights because she used a law, in a way to get those rights, and the case was settled, and she's been otherwise she was fighting that case, for the divorce case, for almost 7 years. But finally she was able to get it because of the kind of pressure that was created, and the judgments from the lower court and the high court were in her favor. So I think he realized that it has to be the right way to settle the matter, and it was settled. Now when I go to colleges and when I talk of domestic violence, a lot of girls say that they are asked to marry, they are asked to leave their engineering degree, or some degree that they're taking up, and the parents suspect that they may have an affair and they may run away, and hence they must get married early. Now that actually is part of it covered in the Domestic Violence Act. Now understand that Domestic Violence Act also protects children below the age of 18. So whether it's a boy or whether it's a girl, anybody below the age of 18, this law will protect them. So we've also fought cases of divorced parents remarried, and the biological father not taking care of a little child who's probably 10 years old, and his education fees not paid. Mother didn't have the means, the stepfather didn't have the same means as his biological father had, and we've used Domestic Violence Act to secure that financial security that was required for a child who was 10-year-old, and the father had to pay the expenses for his school and education, and he promised to pay that till his post graduation. So it is multifaceted in a way where it secures certain basic rights that women or a child must have in a domestic relationship. And the objective of the law is not to break the family, but the objective of the law is to stop violence. It is only when you can stop violence, you will be able to have a dialogue within the family. And only when you can have a dialogue within the family, can you think of improving on the relationship that is there. But I must also say that I mean, the failure of the law is that most of the time people have not understood the objective of this law. So the minute a woman files a case of domestic violence, the other party, especially if it's a married woman, the other party will go and file a case of divorce against the women. And actually that shouldn't happen. But I mean, it happens. That's the hard-hitting reality of life, because it hurts the ego of the person that, oh, this lady has gone to the court against me, and so I should also fight back. But that's not the objective of the law at all. The objective of the law is to create that space for dialogue between family members, and that can only happen when the violence stops. So that's largely of how cases of domestic violence happen. Or I mean, I can go on because there are so many cases that we've dealt with, and so many experiences, good and bad, that we have of dealing with this particular law. Coming to the violence that happens outside the four walls of the family, especially focusing on it happening at workplace. You all go to an educational institution. The educational institution is your workplace, right? So the law on prevention of sexual harassment is a law that applies to all workplaces. It is it has a very inclusive definition of workplace. So whether it's a private organization, or it's in the public sector, or it's the white collar job or a blue collar job, or it's across verticals, whether it's a hospital or an educational institution, or it's an IT company, or it's a manufacturing unit, or it's a service provider, you name it, and it is all covered under this law, including the unorganized sector, which is like the 93% of workforce in India. The organized sector is only the 7% workforce that we see, right? So it's a very inclusive law. This law came about because of a lady called Bhavri Devi, who was a Sathind in Rajasthan, and she was working for the Ministry of Women and Child Development. And Rajasthan has a very high prevalence of child marriage. And in her village, on a day called Tej, which is supposed to be a very auspicious day, a 9-month-old baby was going to be married off. And she tried to stop that marriage from happening. The community where the marriage was happening was an upper caste as compared to her. And so they didn't like a lady interfering to tell them that this shouldn't happen. Also, this lady came from a lower caste, so they didn't appreciate that. And to teach her a lesson, 2 men from the family went and gang raped her while she was working in the field. Now, I would say that she is a brave lady. She's still fighting social ostracization. She's still fighting her challenges and battles in the society because they look at it very parochially. She went to the court. What came as a bigger shock for people like us was the comments passed by the judge, who was hearing a matter. And they said that in the Indian cultural context, where a man of an upper caste will not even touch a woman of a lower caste, there's the question of rape. So they denied rape on the basis of caste. And then there was a group of women rights activists who said that this is not just about Bhavri Devi. This is about every woman who wants to make a place for herself at workplace. And is that safe? Now, was Bhavri Devi the first one to face sexual harassment? No. I mean, there are so many cases before Bhavri Devi where, women have faced sexual harassment at workplace. Nobody spoke about it. So Bhavri Devi's case became a trigger for a group called Vishaka to file a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court heard the matter and they said that, yeah, there's a gap here, that there's a no law situation when it comes to protecting women at workplace. And so they gave the famously called Vishaka guidelines in 1997. Now, it was not sufficient to just have the guidelines because the monitoring mechanism was very weak. And so there was a lot of advocacy done to say that we want a law from the parliament. But to get that law from the parliament, the other trigger was the Delhi rape case. So after the Delhi rape case, there was Justice Verma committee that was constituted by the then UPA government. And the Verma committee report had to see what changes need to be made, especially in the laws related to sexual violence. Right, so there was a Criminal Amendment Act that was passed in 2013 that changed the definition of rape. There were 4 more sections added in the category of outraging modesty of the woman, where it included sexual harassment, it included disrobing a woman with criminal intent, it included voyeurism, and it also included stalking. Right. So, and along with that, Verma also said that we need a law to protect women at workplace, and we need to have a special law related to that. And that is where the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act of 2013 was passed. Now, this law defines that a workplace is not just your premise, but when you go outside your premise, say you go out with your friends for a chai or a coffee or some dinner party, and you're with your friends who are your colleagues at your institute. So there is a working relation between them, and there is something that happens even outside the premise, it will fall under the purview of this law. Right. So sexual harassment can be defined as physical contact or physical advance or, a quid pro quo situation, like somebody asking for sexual favors, or it could be sexual colored remark, which again is a very broad terminology. It doesn't only mean slang words, or it doesn't only mean inappropriate words, but the entire context of the case needs to be understood. So you may be sweet talking, but the context may be very sexual. So that also will fall under the purview. It could mean the messages that are sent on WhatsApp. It could mean what are you doing on social media? Are you targeting somebody on social media to create a situation of sexual harassment? It also includes pornography. And now there is last week there was a judgment from the Supreme Court to say if somebody is watching child pornography, whether it's sent to them by somebody else or they have opened up the website themselves, they have a mandate to report cases of child pornography, or you will be liable under the criminal law of POCSO. Right? So things are changing in this area. These acts could be direct or indirect. And I can give you so many examples of young people being engaged into acts, and they could be unintentional also, right? It's the intention doesn't matter because it's the civil law. What we look at is the impact. Right. One very interesting case that I would like to share is that there were these two people who got recruited through campus, and they joined a very good and a very big name in the IT sector. So they started working together on a project. So you know how it is, right? All the freshers get the orientation done at the same time, so they become friends with each other. And some of these freshers start working on the same project, then they become even great buddies with each other. So this girl was really smart. She was a university topper from the mechanical department, and she had that ambition, to do something differently, bring in innovation in whatever is been given to her. And she was also doing her MTech from BITS. It was an external course that she was doing. So this boy also was put on the same project, and both of them had joined 1 month apart, I think. So he would offer to help her in the dissertation, and she would say, it's okay, I can do it. But he would still offer. So she was being nice, and she said, okay, you can help me with this part. Not that she couldn't do it, but because he offered help, she said, okay. And because they were put on the same project, they would have late night calls discussing about work. Because she was very ambitious and she always wanted to bring in something new in that project. Right now, he misunderstood this whole friendship that was there to think that, he probably thought of a romantic engagement with her. And he hinted to her a couple of times. And when she got to know about it, she was very frank, and she said that, I'm really not interested. We are friends, let's be good friends, but I'm not interested in a romantic relationship. But he kept insisting. He sent her messages saying, ki, when are you introducing me to your parents? And she said, there's no reason why I should introduce you to your parents, and all of that. And finally, because she thought that he's her best friend, she was always looking at him as a best friend, and she thought that he's a best friend. So she confided in him, and she said that, see, I've had a very bad breakup very recently, and I'm not up to engaging into any further romantic relationship. I want to focus on my career. I want to focus on completing my masters, and I will get married to the boy that my parents choose. Now, that was not acceptable for this boy. And but anyway, she got engaged, I think in the month of December 2022. And her marriage was supposed to happen on 2023 May. Yeah, is when her marriage was going to happen. Now, the minute she got engaged, this boy started behaving very weirdly with her. He started staying aloof. He didn't talk to her in the same way. He met with an accident. She wanted to go and meet him because she considered him to be her best friend, but he didn't let her come. He didn't respond to her messages. So she said, okay, let him be. I'm not going to, encroach upon his personal space and force myself on him. So she let him be. In May, just 4 days before her marriage, right, there was a fake Instagram account that was opened in her name. And he posted, she came from a very small town of Maharashtra, culturally very conservative family. What he did was he posted some of her pictures on the Instagram. What were those pictures? Her pictures of dancing somewhere, pictures of her wearing a one piece or a Western dress. So it was not vulgar. There was nothing vulgar about it. I mean, in Pune, people, we see girls wearing that, but in a small town that she came from, probably that was not acceptable, right? So she never wanted to publish these photos. He also posted a photo of hers with her ex-boyfriend. Now, she obviously nobody knew about it, so there was a huge impact, and he sent the request from this fake ID to various people that were common friends. Now, because it was a fake ID, she did not know who had opened it. And all this is happening 4 days before her marriage. Now, in Maharashtra, and I'm sure this kind of a culture would be there in other states also, or other communities also. So, a girl is not supposed to step out of her house after the haldi happens. She's not supposed to go out of the house, right? And all this has happened just after the haldi has happened. Now she doesn't even know if this goes to her husband. It's already gone to some of the common friends and relatives. If it goes to her husband, she doesn't even know whether he's going to marry her. So she said, I have to come clean with my husband. So she goes and meets the husband, or rather, she goes. He says it's okay. You are not at fault with this. So I'm not going to stop the marriage from happening because of this. So we'll continue. But her father-in-law said that you have to file a police complaint before the marriage happens. Right now, she went to the police station in her town. They said that because this is a cyber crime, you have to go to the district police station. So now she has to travel from that small town to the district place, and she's doing all this after the haldi, just 2 or 3 days before her marriage. But anyway, she goes there and she files a complaint. As an impact, she's invited 1,000 people for the wedding, and only 200 turn up. And now the police is saying that it's an Insta account. So if you want to report it and delete it, you have X number of people have to report it, only then we can delete it. Now, those X number of people were in thousands or something like that, 1,000 or 2,000 people. Now, she has to send this link to many people to say, hey, please report this. This is a fake account. Now, people to whom she's sending are seeing her photos that she didn't want to be published. So look at her fate. And she doesn't know who's done it. So she's filed a criminal complaint. Later on, the cyber crime department finds out that the IP address of the phone that was used to create this fake Insta account is in your office. And that's when they detect that this is the man who's done it. And till then, she's working with him. Till then, they are part of the same team. Imagine how it must have felt for her. And she's married to this person constantly with a fear that if there's any fight that comes up, will this whole episode come out? Will I be tortured because of this episode? I'm not at fault. He's agreed. He's accepted me as a wife. But you never know. If there's one disagreement and this whole thing can come out in that fight. So she's lived with constant fear. Finally, when she got to know who it was, she came to us and she said, I want to file a case of sexual harassment here. Now, we asked this boy, what made you make such an account? Were you angry because she was not accepting your proposal? But you have to respect that, right? You have to take a no for a no. You can't force yourself on somebody. So why was it so difficult to, accept somebody not agreeing to your romantic proposal? And then he said, I have not done it. But then there was a criminal case against him. So then he couldn't deny it. Then we said, how did you get these photos? Because she's not shared it with anybody. So first he said that she shared it with me on WhatsApp. So we said, okay, show us the media, WhatsApp media. They didn't have any photographs. Then he said, no, she shared it through Google link. We said, okay, Google Drive. We said, okay, open the drive and show us that she shared it. She had not shared it, which means he's hacked her system to get it. Now, this is a European country. It has its headquarters in France. So they have very strict GDPR rules about, cyber security and all of that. So now, although we did not terminate him under the Posh case, and we said that you have to apologize and you can't, really meet her or talk to her, or you have to work on different days. When she comes to office, you can't come to office and all of that. The policy that the organization has for cyber crimes, where there's sensitive data, they said under this policy we are going to terminate you. We can't trust you because you've hacked a system to get photographs from somebody and posted it on Insta. Our organization will not trust you with sensitive data. And finally, he said, okay, I will resign. And we accepted his resignation because he was a young person. Just out of college. We didn't want to ruin his career for a, that moment of anger that led him to open this kind of a fake Instagram account. But he lost his employment in a good organization. So I think we have to be very careful of what we say, of what we do. We have to take responsibility for our actions. And there are so many cases coming from young people where there's this whole cultural difference. They are not able to accept that cultural difference. Like, for example, somebody coming, the whole urban-rural divide. We see that somebody coming from a rural background is not able to accept the open culture of the urban ladies or girls, and there's a whole lot of rift, and I don't blame them. But I think the minute you are there in that cosmopolitan situation or community, you need to adapt to what is happening around you, and there needs to be a lot of training and awareness to that goes beyond just creating an awareness on the law part of it. Law is one part of it, but are you aligned with the values of your institute, of your organization that you are part of? Do you understand personal space? Do you respect the personal space of the other? Are you going to be assertive when there's something wrong happening with you or with somebody else? How important it is to be assertive. I remember in my school days or in my college days, I was not assertive. Even today, I hesitate to be assertive. That's a culture to be built. And we all need to be assertive to say, hey, I don't like this. And we can do this very politely. Somebody sends a sexist joke. Can we say that, hey, please don't send this, we don't like it? Because a lot of time we think, oh, if I say this, will people call me a bad sports? I mean, I don't even have the sporting spirit to accept a joke. I can't see a joke for a joke. Yeah, but it hurts the sentiments of a few people. They can be sensitive to something like this. So can we stop glorifying or objectifying women by sending those sexist jokes? Can we stop doing that? And if somebody gives you a feedback to say that, hey, this is hurting, I mean, don't send this. Can you just take it as a feedback and, respect that person's personal space and not do it? These are little things that go a long way. Can you stand up for somebody who's filing a case of sexual harassment to give that moral support? Like today, I was in an educational institution, just today afternoon. And there was a staff from an admin, who stares at people. He touches the girls and they don't like it. They had the freshers party. And even when he was told to go out of the room, he was there looking at them dancing. It was very uncomfortable. But the entire class, the entire first and the second year showed solidarity. They were all there to support each other, and they said, we also didn't like this. Although he didn't touch us, we didn't like the lewd comments he was making. We didn't like that he touched some of our, friends from our juniors or seniors. We didn't like it. And we loved the solidarity that these students showed. And we told them that, I mean, do not be scared of retaliation. There are ways in which the committee can stop the retaliation. So every organization with more than 10 people should have an internal committee. I'm sure your organization also has an internal committee. There are UGC guidelines to say that when it's an educational institution, although this law is gender specific, when it comes to educational institution, the boys and the girls are protected as students, because there is a vulnerability when it comes to a relation between students and teachers or students and staff. So if there's sexual harassment that has happened between two students, it will still come to this committee. If it's happened between a student and a staff, it will still come to this committee. If it's happened between a student and a faculty, it will still come to this committee. And the student can be a boy or a girl. In all other places, it's women. But in an educational institution, it's gender neutral. For students only, not for the faculty or the staff. Only for students is gender neutral. So you have the means to report cases. Do not keep quiet when there's something wrong happening. If you want to change, we have to take a stand. It sometimes is painful. It has to, going through the process can be painful. But believe me, taking that stand is important. Setting that example to support each other, to show that solidarity is important. Only then you will be able to correct the wrong that is happening, and the aggravation of the whole violence that happens will be curtailed. It will be stopped. But if we keep quiet, and we say that it's okay, it's happening to me, probably it's only happening to me, it's not happening to others. You don't know, there are many victims who are just keeping quiet and nobody's talking about it. So it's important that we become assertive. It's important that we take a stand for ourselves and for others, right? We have the laws, we need to use them, we need to implement them, right? There always will be gray areas in the law. There's no law that is perfect. Somebody will say, can laws be misused? Yes, every law is misused. I'm not denying that. This particular law has a section to curtail the misuse as well. The committee can take an action if somebody has filed a malicious or a false complaint. But don't be scared of misuse and not talk about it. Because the objective of the law is not to misuse the law. The objective of every law is to protect people, especially the vulnerable groups, people who are vulnerable, right? So make use of it and help each other to, create that safe and healthy work environment, because there's no fairy or a magic wand that's going to do that. We have to take the efforts to ensure that our workplace is safe. We have to take the efforts and ensure that our home is safe, right? We will have to take the responsibility, and there is a law to support when people take that responsibility, right? I can go on because there are so many cases that I can share, but I can see that I'm up with my time. But I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Most welcome. And any questions that you have, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. So we'll now begin with the question answer session. The first question, ma'am, I only have. So
Okay.
while we do have laws in the place to protect women rights, but there is often a huge gap between legislation and the real world application. So what do you think are the root causes of this gap, and how can we bridge it?
Oh, there are many. Uh, uh, there are many gaps. I mean, how do I even talk about listing them, right? It could be that people who are supposed to implement the law well are not doing it. People do not have the means to get those evidences. There are people who may be witnesses but may be scared of taking a stand and helping, people in corroborating what they are saying. The judiciary, the process in the judiciary is a long drawn one. People are scared of going to the courts and may not go to the court. They may not have access to all these systems. They may not have knowledge to about what is happening. They may not be aware. They may not have somebody who can guide them well. It could become a political issue, and hence there would be a lot of debate and all that going, but it really doesn't help the victim. So there could be so many things. I think what we need to do is, on a case to case basis, keep fighting against all these odds and against all these challenges and see what is the best that we can do. You can file public interest litigation wherever there is a gray area or a gap in the law, to point that out and talk about interpreting it or get a clarity on interpreting it. You can suggest that you need a legislation around it. You can look for a legislator who could, put across a private member bill. You could build a network with people from different areas of life, like a lawyer or a police, or like when I have interns coming to me, I do something that is not done in the law college, right? I take them to a police station and say, okay, now understand how the police station works. I introduce them to the senior inspector and say, okay, you tell them how you work. How do you arrest people? How do you interrogate people? So they get to know that system, right? So introducing yourself to this system. We are scared of doing all this. These are people who are public officers. They are for us. We need to access them, but we don't. We are scared. Without that fear, we need to do that. So there are many ways, many strategies that we can use to overcome that whole fear and start using the law and the systems to its fullest capacity, is what I would suggest.
Thank you so much for your answer, ma'am. Okay, guys, questions, please. Please do raise your hand before asking it first.
I have to one question,
Yes.
ma'am. Like I actually feel this every time. As a girl, I it always hits in my mind that we should come first for complaining or for making our voice. But the problem comes there when victim herself does not come in front to say her voice, to call for her any of the problem that she is facing or not.
Right. Yeah, true. There could be some fear. There could be something holding her back, and that is where I said that it's important that we provide that kind of an enabling environment where she gets that voice, or she gets the strength to talk. Like, this girl was not willing to talk against this boy because the hurt that somebody I considered as a best friend did it. To overcome that, she took some time, and finally she realized the consequences of not doing it, and that's when she came out in the open and she said, yes, I have to do it. So there are a lot of limiting beliefs that stop people from coming out and talking about it, but that's where the solidarity to stand up for them, to help each other, and give that moral support comes in.
Yeah.
I can see some questions here. There is Satyam Kumar who said that he's talked about the recent case of the girl who died because of work pressures in EY. Yes, it's very unfortunate, Satyam. And your question is, are there any laws for that? See, everything can't be governed by a law, right? There is some things that organizations need to do as hygienic practices. But yes, are there stress levels? Yes, there are stress levels. Having coaches and counselors available for people to talk. Work Workplaces are regulated by labor laws, so one can check if they are following the labor laws in terms of work hours and all of that. But it's very difficult to monitor. For example, if I'm a workaholic and I don't mind working for 12 or 14 hours, not that people have asked me to, but if I don't mind doing it, then the laws become, I mean, it's not such a strong point, right? If I say that, yeah, I wanted to work, so you can stop me from working. So everything cannot be governed by law, but it's very unfortunate in terms of what has happened in EY, and the kind of empathy that was not shown by people of EY even after a death is even more harrowing and frustrating. But there has to be a work life balance. I totally agree on that. There have to be ways in which there are spaces to vent out. There should be employment engagement programs that allow them to talk to people, some kind of stress busters. And some organizations do support their employees when they go through this, and support them with coaching or counseling. I think these kind of facilities have now become essential at workplaces. People often don't know about labor offices. Swati Tiwari, I completely agree with you. We are not aware of our laws, although there's a principle. The first principle that we study as law students is that ignorance of law is not an excuse. That's the first principle I study. But it's a reality that people don't know law. And very interestingly, I've always thought of this, right? I'm also a student of literature, and Shakespearean language would always be very difficult. So, when I was doing literature in my BA, I would buy Shakespeare books that had his language and that had the simple English language. And I always think that if laws are for people, the language has to be made easy. So I understand the legal language that is important for drafting a law, but can we have something to interpret the law to make it easy for common people? Because not everybody is going to go through a training. Not everybody will read all laws. If you ask me, I don't know all the laws, but I'm trained to interpret laws. So if you give me a law to read, I know how to read it. Right? I know how to interpret it because I'm trained in it. Not everybody is going to be trained. So simplifying the language of the law so that it reaches out to more people has become important. And then probably, because law has an intersection with any profession, whether it's engineering, architecture, pharmaceutical, medical, you name it, and law has and interlink to it, right? There are specific laws. So I think the relevant laws should be taught as part of the curriculum for that, although that's not the focus of the curriculum, it should be part of the curriculum, so they are at least aware of, you know, the laws that relate to them. I think that should be changed.
Kanikaram, I see you have raised the hand. Please go ahead with the question.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
These days, in one of the persons earlier has asked questions about how law is harder to access for people, and these days we see a lot of discussion about a sort of a gender neutral or a uniform law civil code to exist, right? And there has been a discussion opposing it about how particular gender laws help to raise the equity, and we are not ready for it. We are not ready for uniform civil code. What is your opinion on this matter, ma'am?
Okay, so Uniform Civil Code was a demand of the women's group earlier. Uniform Civil Code refers to the family laws, actually speaking. You know, but over a period of time, there have been a lot of changes that have happened even in the family laws. And family laws are personal laws. So a Hindu is governed by the Hindu law, Muslim is governed by the Muslim law, Parsi is governed by the Parsi law, and the Christian is governed by the Christian law. And for intercaste marriages or interreligious marriages, there's a special marriage act for, or even two people from the same community who don't want to go through the legal, the rituals of their particular, religion. They can opt for a special marriage act. You don't have to change your religion or caste or whatever and get married in the court, right? So we have all these laws, and over a period of time, the interpretation of the laws have changed. There has been a lot of inclusion in the laws. I wouldn't say they're up to date, but still the interpretation has changed. Now, when you talk of a uniform civil code, it really has to be secular in nature. If you're going to saffronize it because a particular community is in the majority, that is not the objective of the Uniform Civil Code. So it would really depend on what is it that you're bringing to the table when you're saying you want a uniform civil code. It really has to have the secular nature, and it must overcome the challenges that are there in the personal laws, to say that we want a uniform civil code. Your question about gender neutral laws, most laws are gender neutral. Most laws, almost all laws are gender neutral, except for a few. And there's a reason why some laws are not gender neutral, or they're gender specific, so to say. That is because in our constitution, when we talk of right to equality is among equals and not among unequals. So if you look at the society, and I'm not just talking of India, I have a lot of students coming to me from Germany. I've had students from Harvard Law School. I've had students from the London School of Economics, law students from different parts of the world who have come to me. And when I say, oh, you have a gender neutral law for rape, you have a gender neutral law for domestic violence. So how many cases do you see where a man is raped or a man is facing this? And they say, no, most of the cases that are filed by women. So there is the patriarchy that is there that allows one community to say that, we will overpower the other gender. That is not an equal society. And hence, when I talk of equality, it is among equals. So there are groups that have not really come to that equal level. And so we will have to take certain affirmative actions to bring them to that equal level. So women are part of that vulnerable group because of the patriarchal situation. Children are part of that vulnerable group because of the age. Elderly people are part of that vulnerable group, again, because of age. Transgenders are part of that vulnerable group, or LGBTQIA is part of that vulnerable group because of sexual preference, right? So certain people from certain tribes, from certain castes are part of that, vulnerable groups because they have been deprived because of their caste and because of their religious status for a very long time. So you have to bring them up to a level an equal playing field, and then you can talk of equality. So for you to just simply understand that if I have to make two people run, and there's one person who has a disability in his leg or her leg, and the other person has both the legs fine, and I say, okay, this is the starting line, run that race, we know who's going to win. It's a no-brainer. We know who's going to win. But now, if I say that, okay, this person with both the legs is going to stand here, and the person with one leg, I'm going to probably have another line for that person. I'm going to ensure that there are no stones, there are no boulders on the way so that this person doesn't trip, and now run. Are we even creating a 50% chance for this person with disability to win the race? We are. That is positive discrimination, or that is affirmative action. And so you see, for certain things, there are gender specific laws, not because the other gender is not important, it's just because the circumstances are such that we need to protect one gender because of the vulnerability that they face. That's it, nothing else. But most laws are gender neutral. Most laws are gender neutral.
Thank you, madam.
There is a question in the comment section. What do we do when the police is not supportive when we go to file the FIR? There was an incident recently in Odisha where the couple was beaten when they went to file the FIR for harassment. So there is a fear of filing FIR in general. And will the police staff be supportive? And how can we tackle that?
Yeah, that's a kind of a common problem most people face. So I generally say go with a written complaint, give it to them, take what do you say, an accepted thing that they've received the complaint. If they're not doing anything about it, there is in every police station it's mandatory that they have boards written, right, for all the ranks, right from the senior PI to the DGP. The whole hierarchy is written. So scale it up, escalate it to the next level, right? Or go to the SP or the commissioner, send a copy there. If you have to create a pressure group, they come under the Right to Information Act. If you have given a written complaint and they're not doing anything about it, make a right to information application, then say, what have you done about this? They have to answer that. And one can always file a private complaint to the court directly. Although that's not a very, it's not the same, because the police still has to investigate into the matter. It's just that the court gives the police the order to investigate. But there's a provision in the law to say that you can file a private complaint, criminal case with the judiciary directly. But that's a last recourse. I would say that keep the private complaint as a last recourse.
Okay, ma'am. And there is one more question by Anirudh Singh Bhati. How can we
Yes.
improve the accessibility of law with the help of AI, and how can we make different APIs to reduce the time of cases in court? And is there a scope of making business in this field?
Well, I've been hearing that AI is going to do great in the legal field. Personally, I don't have much knowledge, but I would love to explore and understand how AI would help in the legal field. Accessibility in the court, yes. Can we do e-courts? I think e-filing, that is already there in some of the countries, and less paperwork, also more sustainable environment wise, has to happen. But we are still have to file, although we sometimes do file an e-application, but we have to support it with another hard copy, so it really doesn't make sense. But I think with change in technology, we are way behind in accepting that technology. We have to come to terms that this is going to be the future of India, and this is going to be the future of the world, and we need to accept that, and judiciary also needs to accept that, right? So we are still stuck in this whole old school methods to say, will it be misused, will somebody do a fraud there, and all of that. I think we need to find ways to mitigate that. If AI is going to come in all other fields, the legal field also needs to be prepared to accept AI if it can really help. So I think we need to see the pros also. We can't always be talking of the cons. But interestingly, there was a great Marathi writer who's written many number of books. He's also a alumni of IIT Powai, and he had come to our office and he said, one day I'm going to come and tell you how the legal office or lawyer's office can be run through an AI. I'm waiting for him to come and share that with me. But yeah, and I'm happy to understand how it would really help go ahead and progress and probably reduce the time that litigants have to, go through in the court, like the number of years that they have to fight cases.
One thing, ma'am, I think that AI can do is they can analyze all those court transcripts and legal documents
Yes,
to
yes,
identify the patterns and trends in the judgment. So that will
absolutely.
actually, in a way, help the individuals understand the outcome of similar cases and how they can proceed with it. So,
Absolutely. I won't be surprised if the lawyers are already using Chat GPT to draft their cases. But I think that human touch is still required in every case, right? I mean, yes, you
yes,
can
ma'am.
make use of Chat GPT. I haven't used yet, but yes, you can make. And like you said, yes, a comparative study, research, so many things can happen with AI.
Okay, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
The next question is, how can a wife of Bihar village file FIR against abuse if she's not allowed to go out of the home, even not supported by her parents' house?
Well, and there's a concept of filing a zero FIR. So you can, and these days I don't know about Bihar, but I can tell you in Maharashtra there are helpline numbers that are there, for women, for elderly people, for childline, of course, is across the country. I think for women also it's across the country. So you can make use of these helpline numbers. The other simple thing is to call 100. That's a common number for everybody for police. You call 100, at least in Maharashtra, we have these police squads coming home on the white motorcycles that they have. They come home and one can file a complaint through them. But for somebody who comes from a very conservative family, who doesn't step out of the house, even if the police comes to your door, are you going to have the courage to go and tell the police what's happening to you? Where is that going to come from? Where is that courage going to come from? Because ultimately the police will take down your complaint and there'll be an investigation. The lady still has to stay in that house. So I think there is a lot of support system that is required, like shelter homes, like counseling services, somewhere that where her safety will be taken care of. These kind of support systems are also required. Unfortunately, during the COVID, we got a lot of calls, but these support systems are not working. The police was completely busy with ensuring that people don't step out of the house and punishing them, etc., etc. But shelter homes were not admitting people, and counseling services later started happening online. But there's a limit to a person who's being abused at home using a counseling session from home. They couldn't do it. So there were limitations to how these services provided, but these have to be considered as emergency services. Unless we declare these services as emergency services, like a hospital service or a medical services, women will not be safe at home. So there's a whole lot of seriousness that has to come with the services, and these services also need to improve. There has to be a better budgetary provisions for these services to actually function. So that is something that is not happening right now. Although these services are there, but they don't really function to its fullest capacity. They don't have the budgetary provisions. That's a huge challenge for even people who provide these services.
Thank you, ma'am. Anshuman has a question. I agree, but by making gender biased laws, aren't we ignoring and invalidating the minority cases where other communities are affected? For example, a man can't file a DV unconsensual intercourse case in India. And how does a gender neutral laws place boulders in a path of a specific community?
Well, there are certain, and and non-consensual act will be covered. Uh, it is, yeah. I mean, there are certain, like I said, the situation is such that it's like, there's a there's a gender, there's a community that has suffered for so many centuries. I'm not even talking of 1 century. I'm talking of 5,000 years and more than 5,000 years. And now somewhere probably we are doing something to get them, to that level where we can say that there's a fair playing field. It's still not fair. It's still not fair. Look at the gender gap report that's come. Every year our rank is going down. How many women CEOs can you name as compared to the men CEOs? How many women in leadership position do you know as compared to men? 2 years back, women were allowed to join NDA. 2 years back, we saw the first batch of women becoming fighter pilots. And when did the man become a fighter pilot? Look at, I mean, are we even talking of a fair playing field here? It's not. And so sometimes, yes, is there the other gender will face the brunt of it? Maybe sometimes they will. I'm sorry, but yes, that's a reality. But look at the number of women who still have not gone to school. I was just visiting an Adivasi area last week. As part of my work, I was traveling and I was visiting, and they're still struggling with unemployment. They're still struggling with girls going to school. I saw about 3 or 4 young girls married and having kids at the age of 16 and 17. So, and when I talk to this community, they say, oh, they're not safe here. So are they safe when they get married? It's again considered that the girl is a property of that other man. So, the rest of the men will stay away from her. But that's not the case. That's not happening. So it's unfortunate that we're still struggling with these basic things. So basically gender specific laws are not so that they can be misused or put another gender down. It's not for that purpose. It's to elevate their position in the society and protect them from certain violence that is happening over the period, I'm talking of more than 5,000 years down the line. So I'm not talking of a small period here. I'm talking of a large period here. So I think I'm hoping that, and I have hope in your generation that probably, things will improve and probably we may not need the gender specific law. I'll be more than happy when we come to that point in time when we will not need such laws. I'm not in favor of having so many laws because that only shows that our society is not just. When we have laws for everything, we want laws to govern everything. That only shows how our society is functioning. That means we are not able to take responsibility as humans. And that's the sad part. I think we need to change that, and change begins from us.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. Akshay has a question. Do we need to remember or learn any specific IPC or BNS sections in general?
See, they're all available on the Google. It's difficult to, as a lawyer, I don't know every section. It's difficult. There are so many laws. It's the laws that you keep using on a daily basis that you tend to, remember and memorize. So it's difficult to study. If you're really interested, keep reading and keep understanding, and then you will eventually learn and memorize. But there's no particular section that you must know. But if there is a particular section that you're interested in, it's all available on Google. It's at the tip of your finger. So it's not very difficult these days. But out of curiosity, yes, you can read the law and understand what it means. There are so many articles also that people write around certain laws.
Kanikaram, you have raised your hand again. Please proceed ahead.
Hello, ma'am. You have
Yes.
brought up Adivasi women, queer women, etc. And
Yes.
now it is known that often people who are from different marginalizations get invisibilized more than people who are not. And Western feminism has also been talking about intersectionality as of late. How essential do you think that discussion is to our law system? I mean, where do you
It
think
is
our law
essential.
system fails in that regard?
It is essential. I would say, rather than the terminology gender neutral, I would rather prefer a gender inclusive word. So that then we are not restricting it to merely a binary gender of man and woman, because there are so many other genders that we recognize now. People recognize themselves under so many genders. So I think that diversity, that plurality, that inclusiveness is important, and hence the discussion is important, that we should have a discussion on intersectionality, uh, because it's fluid. You cannot restrict it, like I said, in the binaries. Now it is fluid, so intersectionality is important when you talk of gender.
Thank you.
Okay,
Ma'am,
I
I
think
had one question. I had one question, one last question.
Yeah.
So you did mention about having students from other countries. So what do you think? Like, how do Indian laws regarding women rights compare to those of other countries, and what best practices can we actually learn from them?
Well, I think when I visited some countries and I've seen some of these courts, we make it a point to go and visit to see how they function. I think they are far, uh, what do you say, progressive sometimes. But I also think that it's a very person centric thing, also, right? While we expect our judges and judiciary to be neutral, there will be subjectivity in the way a judge decides, whether it's in India or whether it's in some other Western country. But I think they take their laws and compliances far more seriously than we do. The way their legal education happens is also very different. Some of it is based on application. And I think some of our colleges and some of our universities are moving towards that. But yeah, they don't have as many laws as we have. They don't have as many, the diversity that India has. They don't have that kind of a diversity. There's nothing like a caste there. They don't have so much of, when it comes to a woman and a man. Yeah, I'm not saying that there's no discrimination. There is discrimination, but not for the basic things that we are fighting for. So I think in terms of the development also, it's very different. Circumstances are different, culture is different, and so all that does have an impact on the way their legal systems work and the way their judiciary works. I wouldn't say that I have exposure to every judiciary, but we are far away behind in certain things, like in technology, in going paperless, in the number of litigations that are filed, in simplifying certain ways in which litigations are filed. Also, this is also relatable to the population, right? I mean, their population, our population, we can't just compare. And we don't have the human resource that is in proportion to the population. We don't have the number of judges in proportion to our population. We don't have police force that is in proportion to our population. So that also is something that is to be considered, and that makes a whole lot of difference in how any of their systems work and in how our systems work.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we can have more questions as well, but this session will be never ending, and we do have a time constraint here, so we'll be needing to end it here now. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful presentation and for sharing your expertise with us today. Your dedication to educating women's right and empowering them is truly inspiring. That is what I feel. And we definitely appreciate the valuable information that you provided to us and the engaging discussions that we had in the end. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Your presence
Yeah.
and participation in this definitely makes a difference, and we hope you found today's session both informative and empowering. Remember, the journey towards understanding and advocating for women's rights doesn't end actually here. There is a long way to go. Ma'am, do you have
I
any
would just
closing
say,
words?
yeah, I would just say that I know I'm not been able to answer everybody's questions here, and I'll be happy to answer them. So if they can be collated and sent to me by email, I'll make an attempt to answer those questions. I'm not saying that I know it all, but I'll make an attempt based on my exposure to this or my experience that is there. And I'll be happy to come back again if there's any specific law that you want me to talk about. I'll be more than happy to interact and share my experiences on that particular law. And thank you so much. I enjoyed the interaction. So you're all doing great, and I'm sure there'll be certain takeaways from this. The biggest takeaway is stand up for your rights. Don't keep quiet. Support each other when they are fighting for their rights. It makes a whole lot of a difference to have that power of solidarity with each other, and be assertive, right? So that, I would say, sums up. If you really take that stand, I'm sure we'll make a beautiful society.
Thank you. And definitely, guys, don't feel disappointed that we didn't take your question, Shailendra Rana. We'll definitely have it collected and send it to ma'am so that we can get the answers better. Due to time constraint, we do have to end it here. So sorry for that. But again, and we'll definitely try to call ma'am for another session as well. So that is also there. And yeah,
Thank you.
so thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
so much,
ma'am.
and for others, for the audience here, stay tuned for our upcoming episodes in Voices of Power Women Shaping Tomorrow. We'll be continuing to explore other important topics as well and hear from more remarkable women. Keep an eye out for the announcements, and feel free to share what you have learned today with your others. Like, that is what the point was. If you have learned something today, that you can share with your family, friends, and people. Now, together, I believe that we can inspire change and shape a brighter future for all. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.
Night.